So I picked up this swivel jaw, swivel base vise on Facebook Marketplace, and it is in need of some love. The pivot lock is broken, one of the feet is broken, and the swivel jaw is completely seized. Now, if you've never seen a swivel jaw vise, here's a smaller version of what it should be. Basically, the rear jaw should be able to pivot so you can grab uneven and non-parallel objects. First thing to do with this is to put it in some rust removing soak overnight and see if we can't free up this rear jaw before we take it apart. So the first thing I'm going to do with this is put it in some rust removing soak. This is some older product. It's been in this bucket for a while and I've used it on a few projects, which is kind of nice because you can kind of keep using this. This is the WD-40 Specialist Rust Removing Soak. It's safe for your skin and it dissolves rust pretty quickly. It loses its efficacy over time if you use it a bunch, so it wasn't as quick as it had been in the past, but in a day I got a lot of the rust off. Now I'm trying to free up that swivel jaw. There's no pins or anything keeping it in place, but it has a lot of surface area, so any rust in there can really seize it up. Now, normally you can kind of knock these loose with a mallet. In this case, it really didn't want to move, so I put it up in the big post vise, and I tried to grab it with a wrench to sort of use some controlled leverage. That didn't seem to work either, and then finally I just used kind of like a wooden stick and a steel hammer, and I was able to push the back of it over just enough to break that free and knock the jaw out. Now that's obviously a huge component of this vise. If you've never seen a swivel jaw vise before, they're super useful, and this one has a swivel base as well. You can see that broken foot, which is going to have to be TIG welded as well. And there's a bunch of holes in the base. Those are for a locking pin. And the first thing I'm going to do now that it's all apart is use the wire wheel to get any of the rust that the soak didn't take care of. Now I want to make sure that this whole thing is pretty clean. I'm not going to be painting it, but I want it still to not have a lot of surface rust because I want to cover it in boiled linseed oil when it's all done. Now the swivel jaw is kind of starting to work, but it has some high spots and some burrs in it, I think, from people hitting it with a hammer or just some kind of corrosion. So I take a file and I start to kind of file down some of the ways so that this thing can move more smoothly. Couple little wire wheel shots there as well, and it's sliding in from one side, but it won't travel all the way through. So I'm just using a file, and if you look at the way I'm using the file, it actually has a safe edge on it, which means one of the sides of the file has no teeth, so I can run that up against an area that I don't want to abrade, and I can use it kind of slowly working through and making that action work that much better. Filing just little bits off the back side and inside that track gets me just where I need to be so that this thing can move very smoothly through its entire range. A little bit of Scotch-Brite in there too kind of helps out with that. And now you can see I'm able to actually rotate it 360 degrees around, which you'll never have to rotate that much, but I want it to be as freely moving as possible. A little more work with the file just to make sure that it's nice and smooth and no binding spots, and this thing is good to go. Now this is the rotation lock pin, and basically what this does is it has a little spring on it, and you see those holes in the base. By lifting it up, it pops into those holes. There should be a little disc on top of it, and we'll fix that and rebuild that later. Right now I'm just making sure it works and cleaning up any holes. Next thing I do is work on the dynamic jaw. Now you'll notice I didn't take the lead screw out of this, and that's because it was kind of peened in, but I did want to clean up the slides on the jaw itself. And I used the Pferd diamond-coated wire wheel for this. I recently did a video about this. You can just see the difference in the finish it gives. It doesn't remove any material, but it brightens up material incredibly well and removes rust and mill scale, paint, just super, super efficiently. So you can see how nice it looks over there in the vise. I go back to a regular wire wheel and just continue to clean up the vise as I can without having to take off that screw and the meatball on the end. So the next thing I want to do here is fix that broken foot. Now, I thought of a couple different ways to do this, and I was originally going to use some silicon bronze, but instead I'm going to try some nickel rod TIG welding. First thing I have to do though before that is cut up a piece of plate and get a new foot prepared. So this is some 1/2-inch mild steel that I had laying around, and I'm just going to chop this up on the bandsaw before I go over and kind of cut it to the shape it's going to need to be in order to fit against the other foot. I'm going to drill the hole in this piece before I cut it up because it'll be easier to do, and I'm going to drill it out to, I want to say, about 5/8, just a little bit bigger than 1/2 inch so that it would match the other holes. Since this was originally a cast piece, the holes aren't perfectly round in the other feet and the shape isn't exact. So I'm going to kind of go with what I think will work. And you can see I trace it out, and then I'm going to go cut it on the portaband so that it fits kind of like a key into the other piece. Now, I've never done any mild steel to cast iron welding in this way. I've done cast iron repairs, but always cast to cast. So I'm interested to see how this is going to come out. I put some pretty nice bevels on it so that there's a lot of room for the filler metal to go. And I prepare everything and even grind the base itself so that there's a nice kind of receiving piece right there ready for it. Now over on my TIG bench, it's a nice cast iron bench that I can sink some heat into. I grab some Tech Rod 99 and then I go ahead and knock off the flux that's on it. My buddy Matt, whose Instagram name is Metal Meat, is an incredible welder and gave me some tips on how to do this. So I knock off the flux and then scrape it off, and then I preheat the metal, both the base metal and the new piece of steel, with a little torch to try to give it some heat so that it'll sink into it and hopefully not crack. Now you can see I'm getting some sparks off my TIG torch, which is not normal, but it seems to be working. I'm preheating, welding, and then peening it with the back of a hammer to try and avoid any cracking. And after kind of getting these first couple of welds in and then being a little porous, I sort of got the hang of it and continued to fill in as needed. Now again, normally I'd use silicon bronze for this, but I didn't want to have that gold look on it. I wanted to try to make it match the existing kind of metal, silver, steel look. And this was just a good kind of experiment and a good little lesson on trying this. I like to try and learn different processes, especially when I'm restoring tools, just to kind of expand my own knowledge base and expand my skills. So if a client job comes in that involves welding to cast, I know I can at least give it a shot. Now, after going through the process of welding and peening this on the top and bottom, I wanted to weld some of the sides. I wasn't able to get like a really full penetration throughout the piece. Not sure if maybe the cast was just softer than the mild or what it was. So I wound up welding the sides just as I did the top, just to kind of make sure that I filled as much of the weld as possible, much as the crack as possible. So I clean it off with a wire brush and kind of just clean up the top section. And then I know that you're supposed to let these cool slowly. So I put it in a bucket of sand and kind of let that encapsulate some of the heat so it doesn't cool too quickly and crack. Now the other cast iron repair to do on this is on the jaw. There was a pretty bad chip right in the front corner of the jaw, and it would really kind of affect the way that the vise worked if you were trying to do really fine work. So I thought I would try to weld it. Unfortunately, I positioned my camera perfectly so that you can't see what I'm doing and you get to look at the back of my welding hood, but you can see what the weld looked like after I put it on there. Now this I was trying to be especially careful with because I really didn't want to go too heavy on this and melt any more of the material than I had to. So I'm kind of trying to be light here and really trying to convince that nickel rod to flow into the cast iron. And then I'm grinding right after I'm done with it. And you can grind this right after you weld it because that grind is actually going to produce a little bit more heat and it'll actually help keep the part from cooling too quickly, I found. So I'm welding, grinding, peening, and just sort of going through the process to square up this jaw. And despite the fact that my head's in the way, you can see that it's getting closer. Now I check it with a feeler gauge and a little square, and you can see it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And I'm very happy with the repair. And then I stick this in the sand while I go and grind the base. Now grinding the base out, I'm just basically taking as much of the nickel down as I can without hitting the actual steel. I'm trying to avoid kind of making those sparks, and then I can trace out what I want the foot to be, and I can cut that over on the bandsaw. Now I'm just trying to get this to a general rounded shape. It doesn't have to be anything perfect. If anything, if it looks a little uneven, it'll look more like its cast counterparts. I go over to the belt grinder and grind this out, make it nice and round, and then I can put a little tiny chamfer over on the edges. I can use my little Dremel with a carbide burr to clean up any weld that's stuck into the center of the hole, and it just makes real quick work of the nickel and the cast. Blow it off with an air gun, and then I'm going to go ahead and needle scale it. Now the needle scaling will do a little bit of peening to the nickel, but it'll also kind of mimic the look of the original cast iron. Even though it's a shiny steel color, once everything sort of patinas over time, you might not be able to tell that this was even welded. Now that that's done, I do a little test assembly of the vise and see how it's fitting. You can see how the jaws line up really well now, and that welded jaw actually looks really good, which I was very happy with. And the jaw still functions and rotates really well. The next thing I need to do is make a new pin. Now this is a different swivel jaw vise, and you can see that little tapered pin that keeps the jaw in place. In order to make the pin, I'm going to do some measurements with a caliper, and then I'm going to go and turn one out of steel on the lathe. I measure the top diameter and the bottom diameter to kind of get an idea of the taper and the depth, and then I can go ahead into the machine shop onto the lathe and turn a pin out of some 1-inch bar stock. This thing had a pretty gnarly end on it, but I was able to just kind of turn that off, and then I just turned down the diameter and kind of moved through the process. Now I set my compound at a 3-degree angle, and that seemed to be correct to get the proper taper, and then I could move through and turn this piece down. By setting the compound at that angle, I get a nice consistent turned piece, and then I kind of check it against the actual vise body because it's light enough and small enough for me to put in position. I have a good fit there and the jaw is not moving, so I can go ahead and continue to turn it down. I didn't get a great surface finish on this, but it's okay. I think the turning tool had a little chip in it, but it's fine. I'm going to grind it and it'll work out in the end. Once that pin is turned down, I can go ahead and make the swivel lock pin. So I put the original swivel lock bolt in there and then just used the vice grip to pull the old threaded stud out. To make this, I just threaded a 3/8 inch bolt that I cut the head off, and then I had to do some straightening with a mallet before I just turned the threads off. It didn't really need to be anything specific, and I really didn't think I needed to cut virgin threads on a piece of rod to make this part. Also off camera, I cut a little kind of shouldered mushroom piece, which I'm going to use as the top of the swivel lock, and I'll weld that on a little bit later. Over on the bandsaw, I cut off the pin and I cut off the bolt head. I just cleaned up the pin over on the grinder. It didn't have to be anything special, and then I'll go ahead and move up the grits to clean it up and make it even smoother. You can see the way it works right there. Pops in and locks the jaw, and actually looks pretty good. So you can see the swivel lock pin and the way it goes into all those holes. I had to make sure it fit before I welded it, and I had to do a little bit of kind of finessing to it and kind of sanding it down to make sure that it fit perfect. The way this works is there's a spring in between the top pin and the bottom pin, and basically you lift it up, it gives some spring tension and locks it in place. I let it sit down just a little bit, then I fused it with my TIG welder before filling it in. I'm using a Furick cup on my TIG machine, and the guys over at Furick were just nice enough to send me a kit, so go check them out. I'll leave a link down below. I'm really liking using the gas lens. Once that's cooled down a little bit, I take the grinder and just smooth off the top of the head. It actually got hot enough that it gave it like a little bit of a gold temper color, and I'm going to leave it like that because it looks cool. Now time for assembly. I had some heavy duty grease in this grease gun, and I'm basically just sliding it on all the moving parts and sliding it on that spring-loaded pin before I go ahead and assemble everything. I also sprayed a little bit of white lithium grease in there so that it would just move that much better, and I put some grease on the threads of this bolt. I actually looked up to check if this bolt was a replacement, but it actually was the factory installed bolt with that square head, which I think is pretty cool. I put some grease on the swivel base, on the swivel jaw, on every part that I possibly could that I thought would rub against itself, and you can see that that piece is really free and moving well. I also put some grease on the threads, and then again, I'll go and slide this whole thing together and tighten it up. Now, I realized at that moment that the pin I had made was too long. It was interacting with the back of the dynamic jaw, so I cut it down, and then it worked out perfect. It just so happens that the spacing on this base works out just enough to fit my strong hand table with some 1/2-inch bolts, so I'm able to bolt it down, and I can show you how it works. You can see the way I'm able to use the swivel lock to lock it in place, and then the jaw's working well, the dynamic jaw moves well, and everything's really coming out great. Last thing I wanted to do was cover it with some boiled linseed oil, which is basically a paintless protector for old tools like this. I like this as a finish because if I do any hot work on this, I don't want to be melting off any paint, and it's sort of just a nice way to keep it from rusting, but give it a really cool kind of aged patina look. And you can see the little gold temper colors on the top of that spring pin, and I think that looks kind of nice too. Now you can see it in action. Here's a normal kind of crescent wrench, and it's got a tapered handle. So normally I wouldn't be able to grab it, and then by pulling out the pin, I get a really nice self-adjusted angled vice grip, which is just super convenient. Here again on a hammer, anything with any sort of angle to it, you can grab once you pull that pin out. And here's a more extreme version of kind of the same thing. This is a failed scissor half that I tried to make, and you can see the jaw just self-adjusts and grabs on perfect. Overall, I'm super happy with how this thing came out. It's something that I'm going to use in my shop probably daily. I have a couple of other swivel jaw vices, but this one I think will live on one of my benches where I'm constantly trying to grab weird things. Hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up, and check me out on Instagram. Thanks.